Welcome to the Higher Power Podcast, presented by Higher Power Sports PT, the show dedicated to helping active individuals like you unlock your full potential through expert insights on injury prevention, performance enhancement, and recovery. Kurt Kessler is a board-certified specialist in sports physical therapy and an athletic trainer. In each episode, he and his guests bring you the latest evidence-based strategies to help you move better, feel stronger, and stay injury-free. Let's learn together.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Higher Powered Podcast. Today we're going to take a deeper dive into exercise-associated muscle cramps. Now, if you have had these before, you know it and probably remember it really well. This is a maximal involuntary muscle contraction that happens during intense exercise. If this has happened to you, or if you have seen it happen to somebody else, you often see people grabbing for the Gatorade, pickle juice, or mustard packets, or a banana. And if that happens during a game, you'll see the athletic trainer holding them into a full stretch of the cramping muscle. But there's a lot of old school thinking surrounding these types of muscle cramps, and we're going to walk through some of those thoughts and research that might shape a new perspective on this. So first thing, a lot of what I present here is not my original thoughts or research. I got the basis of this information from the Prehab Podcast with former host Dylan Caswell, and that episode was recorded in January of 2023. I thought this podcast was so good, and it has stuck with me ever since, so I wanted to share the information from it. And I'll mix in a few of my thoughts along the way as well, but a vast majority of this is coming from the Prehab Podcast. So the common belief is that these cramps are caused by dehydration, electrolyte imbalances, low potassium, or magnesium. At one point, low potassium was considered the new cause for the cramping. Athletes started taking more potassium, and the cramps were still happening. Then we had it all figured out. It wasn't potassium, it's magnesium. Athletes started eating and supplementing with magnesium, and the cramps still happened. So what is it? I'll go through each culprit presented and the reasoning why each common suspect may be innocent. The first question to ask is the exercise we are doing really intense enough to decrease electrolyte concentration, which is highly regulated by the brain? Then the next question, if electrolytes are tightly regulated by the brain throughout the entire body, why would it create a local cramping response, meaning isolated muscle cramps in one muscle or a muscle group as opposed to the entire body? And you see this with different types of cramping. More systemic situations such as dialysis for diabetes or the flu that affects deeper muscles of the body. But speaking specifically for exercise-associated muscle cramps, we are getting a local or isolated response of a specific muscle or muscle group, and it has long been attributed to a systemic matter in electrolyte concentration. Another question, and this one might be the one that stood out to me most when I listened to it originally a few years ago. If the issue is electrolyte imbalance, which is low sodium or low potassium, magnesium, chloride, whatever electrolyte, and we drink Gatorade or take a mustard packet or whatever, it can take anywhere from 20 minutes to 3 hours for our bodies to digest those nutrients. But the cramps don't last for 20 minutes to 3 hours. They last for a matter of seconds or minutes. So if it takes that long for the electrolyte imbalance to be restored, how do the muscles stop cramping before that change has been made? At the time of that recording, there were no research articles published that showed a difference in electrolyte levels in athletes that were experiencing the cramping versus athletes who are not. There are now several studies that suggest there is zero correlation between electrolyte levels and exercise-associated muscle cramps. The thing that has been most effective in stopping muscle cramps has been rest and passive stretching. If the issue was electrolyte depletion, then why would passive stretching be the intervention that stops the cramping. So when we go to dehydration, there's a meta-analysis study published in 2008 that studied a number of different research articles and came out with these results. At the time of the publishing, there were no published studies that showed that athletes experiencing muscle cramping were more dehydrated than athletes who were not. Another important note is that the athletes studied and compared were of the same gender, the same race, and similar finishing times of that race. There is evidence in a few published studies that dehydration was not associated with muscle cramping. So then we ask, does heat or the environment play a role? The Prehab Podcast tells us that the earliest reports of muscle cramping were men working on steamships and mines in hot, humid conditions. Is exercise-associated muscle cramps more common in hotter and humid environments? A study of NFL players showed that 95% of cramping was happening in hot weather. So then the question is, if all these muscle cramps are happening in hotter weather, can they also happen in cooler weather? And the answer is yes, it absolutely does happen in moderate to cooler temperatures. There are studies that show swimmers swimming in cooler temperature water still getting exercise-associated muscle cramps. One study took place at a long-distance race and found that 18% of the runners sustained muscle cramps, and that race took place in 50-degree weather. So then the question is, if our internal temperature or our core temperature increases, does that produce a greater likelihood of exercise-associated muscle cramps? There has been nothing to support or suggest that that would be the case. They even studied passive heating structures, so people lying on a heating pad or on a hot pack to increase the temperature of the local muscle, and that had no impact on the presence of muscle exercise-associated muscle cramps. And that makes sense. A lot of the times we are prescribing or suggesting heating muscles prior to exercise to help with relaxation of that muscle or to decrease tightness or symptoms associated with that. So then, if the cause of muscle cramping was hot and humid conditions, the remedy would then be to cool the tissue to stop the cramping. And there has been no support or evidence for this line of thought either. What about hydrating before events? Now, we did touch on dehydration a little bit, but does hydrating before events directly prevent muscle cramps? Just about every coach and most athletic trainers have said this at one time or another, but is there any truth behind it? In terms of preventing muscle cramping, the answer is no. There has not been any correlation found between the amount of water consumed prior to activity and the state of muscle cramping. That's not to say don't hydrate, but a lot of people think, oh, if I drink more, then I will not get a muscle cramp. And one thing to note here is that overhydrating is not good for performance either, because then we go back to electrolyte levels. You would be decreasing electrolyte concentration. So now we know that none of this seems to matter in terms of preventing muscle cramps, but it does certainly play a role in performance. There is just a little bit of evidence to suggest that overconsumption of water prior to exercise could actually contribute to muscle cramping. The evidence isn't strong, but there's a little bit there. Another quick note that he mentions, making sure that hydration efforts are coming from good sources. Not all liquid is created equal in terms of hydration. So beverages with high caffeine content, high sugar content can actually have a negative effect on hydration status compared to water or light sports drinks. So that means coffee, soda, energy drinks, high sugar juices, not what you're looking for in terms of producing hydration. So now this all kind of sounds complicated. In order to hydrate, I'm supposed to drink fluids, but only certain fluids. And if I don't hydrate enough, then I'll be dehydrated, which will affect my performance. But if I drink too much, then I'll be overhydrated, and it'll also affect my performance. There are really two easy ways to assess your hydration. The first one is the color of your pee. A darker yellow signifies lower hydration levels. Clear pee that looks like water is a sign of overhydration. So you're aiming for a lighter yellow color to tell you that you're adequately hydrated. Another good thing that you can use is your thirst level. If you are thirsty, you are already dehydrated. That is your body's mechanism to tell you that so that you know to drink water. So then, if you go back to the NFL study that showed 95% of the cramping happening in hot, humid weather, when is this time of season for these football players? It's generally at the beginning of the season. We're talking end of summer, August, September practices and training camps that start in July. And I'll even throw in, from my own experience here, working in the high school and collegiate level, our highest incidence of muscle cramping is generally happening in the first 2 weeks of football season or in the first 3 weeks or so of soccer. So some other factors to look at for the beginning of the season, especially at the high school level: the multiple practices each day, the perceived exhaustion, the chronic workload going from summer sports into a spike in workload in preseason. There is an acclimatization period of a week or so before the season. And there are also rules in place for equipment-intensive sports, but these are more to prevent heat illness, not necessarily muscle cramping. And even with some preseason programs or club sports or whatever the case may be, the workload and capacity of the body system as a whole is not used to all the factors of that training environment. Because both in my experience and in this NFL study, the prevalence of muscle cramping significantly drops after 1 week of the season. So then let's look at the intensity of exercise. They reference a study done at an Ironman race with 210 participants. They took baseline information before the race, training, personal best times, and cramping history. 44 people cramped during the race. What they found was that muscle cramps were more associated with faster overall racing times. Intensity of exercise was the number one independent risk factor associated with cramping in these athletes. Another study looked at 1,300 marathon runners, and they found risk factors were longer distances, presence of fatigue, but more importantly, running at faster paces than their training pace. The nervous system is what tells the muscle to contract and relax. The runners that reported cramping reported muscle fatigue shortly before the onset of the cramp. So they wanted to figure out what was the link between muscle fatigue and cramping. So they asked the question, what creates muscle fatigue? The answer is doing repetitive activity. That's what depletes energy stores, changes the chemical interactions in muscle tissue, goes back to the electrolyte and dehydration theories. But people can run long distances and go for long bike rides. Those are repetitive activities, and not everyone is cramping. But doing those activities at an intensity that the body isn't accustomed to, so then you tie in the other factors like hydration. Muscles are less likely to become fatigued when adequately hydrated, less likely to become fatigued with proper electrolytes. You are less likely to become fatigued when your sleep and recovery habits are strong, less likely to become fatigued when your training parameters are enough to create adaptation without breakdown of the system. But when you boil it down, it goes back to the nervous system. For a muscle to contract, it starts at the brain, travels to the spinal cord, down to the appropriate level of whatever muscle needs to move. It leaves the spinal cord, goes down the nerve, and whatever branch goes to the specific muscle in the nerve and tells it to contract. So if a muscle cramp is a maximal muscle contraction, then the issue must be with the response that causes muscle relaxation. One of the complexities to this situation is the system wants feedback from the muscle so that it can place the appropriate amount of tension on the muscle during contraction. Not every contraction is 100% maximal, so the system wants to know when it's time to contract and relax. With each muscle, there are sensory receptors inside the muscle and inside the tendon that help control contraction and relaxation of each muscle. To simplify this, the receptors in the muscle are responsible for having the muscle contract. The receptor in the tendon, they are responsible for limiting the stretch on the tendon. So stopping or limiting the contraction and therefore is responsible for relaxation in the sense that it tells the brain that the muscle is being put on too much stretch, and if you keep contracting the muscle, it's going to tear. So then the brain relaxes the muscle. So there have been some studies that suggest when a muscle is fatigued, its ability to regulate these neuromuscular functions decreases. Also, fatigue increases the activity of the receptors within the muscle and decreases the effectiveness of the receptors within the tendon. So they looked at electrical activity within the muscle after it had cramped and found that the electroactivity of the muscle was higher after sustaining the cramp, which just supports the idea that receptors within the muscle are more active and causing contraction. So in this electrically excited state, the muscle is more likely to sustain a cramp than when the muscle is at its normal resting state. So that is why after you have a cramp and it resolves, the muscle still feels tight and it's more likely to cramp again. And this commonly happens in muscles that cross two joints. Think of the main muscle of the quads, the rectus femoris, crosses the hip and the knee. One of the muscles that makes up your calf, the gastroc, crosses both the ankle and the knee. Hamstrings cross both the hip and the knee on the back side of the leg. So when you have these muscles that are active in the movement of multiple joints, they can tend to fatigue quicker, potentially. And if they're in a position where they're trying to contract both joints, then the receptors in the muscle are working from two ends, and the receptors in the tendon are being inhibited at both ends. So when a muscle is cramping, we want to stimulate the receptors in the tendon to allow the muscle to relax. And we do that through static stretching. So now think of the athletic trainer who runs out on the field and is standing there stretching out the athlete's calf or hamstring or whatever the muscle is, because that static stretching is what stimulates the tendon and inhibits the muscle. That's why static stretching is such an effective intervention for muscle cramps. So to wrap this up, if we understand what contributes to muscle cramping, then we can work to prevent it. My thoughts on this are similar to my thoughts and philosophies overall in athletic training and physical therapy. The body is a system, and rarely just one factor contributes to why certain things happen within our body. While dehydration and electrolyte imbalance is not directly related to muscle cramping, they contribute to the overall state of the system for optimal performance. So when a muscle cramp happens, chugging water or Gatorade or mustard packets or taking salt tablets, those are not going to make much of a difference in the muscle after it has already cramped. Static stretching and rest are really the only things that are going to change that cramp. But by priming the system prior to intense activity with good hydration and electrolyte balance and proper training, that is what is going to help prevent cramping. The biggest takeaway here is that muscle cramping happens when the intensity of exercise or activity is beyond what the system has been trained for. So to go back to seeing this early in the season, especially during games and not practices, is because during a game situation, the objective is to win, and we often do that at any cost and push ourselves harder to try to make winning plays. So instead of jumping to blame the athlete for not hydrating or not taking certain aspects of their preparation seriously, we as performance providers and coaches need to make sure that the training programs or practices that we are giving these athletes are planned to gradually increase the intensity to the point where we are closely mimicking game intensity. So either in off-season programs or practices, gradually increasing the intensity so that each athlete's movement system is adapting and better equipped to meet the demands that they're placing on the system on the field during games. We should be working towards that game intensity. Not going there 0 to 100, but gradually getting there, because the body's system doesn't like quick changes. It likes to gradually be introduced to certain things. For individual sport athletes, the race or the event is going to be tempting to push or try to push harder to improve your time. That's fine. Just know that it increases the likelihood of cramping. And if you want or need to hit a certain time, then your training should be adjusted accordingly. An easy example here is think about the weather we get here in central PA, especially in the spring. One week it'll be high 70s, the next week it'll be in the 40s. We don't like experiencing these big swings in temperature, just like our system doesn't like big swings in intensity of exercise or frequency of exercise. We like to easily adjust from a winter coat to a sweatshirt to a long sleeve t-shirt down to a t-shirt or tank top for hot weather. The movement system likes a gradual change so that it can adjust appropriately. That's going to do it for today's episode of the Higher Powered Podcast. Another shout out to Dylan Caswell, formerly of the Prehab Podcast, for the original episode and the ideas and for breaking down the research so that myself and others can understand and share with everybody else. You can find ways to connect in the show notes and find me on Instagram at Higher Power Sports PT. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.
That's a wrap for today's episode of the Higher Powered Podcast, presented by Higher Powered Sports PT. We hope you gained valuable insights on how to stay strong, move better, and prevent injury, all backed by expert knowledge in sports physical therapy and athletic training. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. Your support helps us bring more evidence-based tips and strategies to active individuals just like you. For more resources or to connect with us, head over to hpsportspt.com. That's hpsportspt.com. Remember, you've got the power to perform at your best. Keep training smarter, recovering faster, and living stronger. Just a reminder that the content shared in this podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. It should not be considered medical advice. Always consult with a qualified healthcare professional before making any changes to your health or treatment plan. Thanks for tuning in. We hope to see you next time on the Higher Powered Podcast.